So, Nidhi, I don't see participants. Oh, okay, they have started joining.
In the bottom line, there is a participant first.
Okay. So should we start?
I think we can start. Okay. So good evening. I welcome you all to this webinar. My name is Abhiman Das. I work in the economics area as professor here, and I'm also the chair of the center, what we call Misra Center for Financial Markets and Economy. I welcome Dr. Debarpita Roy, fellow at the ICRIER, to this center. Just to give a brief, this center undertakes practical and executable research on financial markets and economy that addresses issues related to formulation of policy, market structure, regulations, including central bank's mandate, monetary policy, fiscal developments, real estate, microstructure, including commodities, banking, bond markets, SME financing, and financial inclusion, insurance. I think whole gamut of issues we deal with here. We also facilitate a wider scope for research by faculty and PhD students working particularly at the intersection of finance and economics. Sometimes we are engaged with relevant stakeholders who influence this policy and also those who are influenced by those policy changes. Okay, with this brief introduction about the center's activity, I hand it over to Professor Sanket Mahapatra to take it over for the webinar today. Over to you, Sanket. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to an exciting talk by Dr. Debarpita Roy. So I'm Sanket Mahapatra. I'm a faculty in the economics area at IIM Ahmedabad. So let me give a brief introduction to Dr. Roy before we start the webinar. So Dr. Debarpita Roy is a fellow at ICRIER. Her research at ICRIER pertains to the India's contemporary urban issues. She has a PhD in economics from CESP at Jawaharlal Nehru University and a master's from the Delhi School of Economics, which also happens to be my alma mater. She has worked as an assistant professor at the School of Real Estate at Amity University and as a consultant with NCAR. And she has also worked in industry at JLL, which is an international property consulting firm, as a manager, and she has built up a pan-Indian real estate database. And she has published in international journals of repute. She has presented her research at several international conferences. So her interests encompass regional and urban economics, real estate economics, economics of housing and infrastructure. And so the topic that she'll be talking about today is about demand for housing in urban India, an empirical approach. So we are very pleased to have Dr. Roy together with us. So in terms of questions, the participants are free to ask questions on the chat window. We'll have a couple of pauses in between the presentation as to if there are some clarificatory questions that can be addressed. And if there are more substantive questions that can be addressed at the end of the seminar. So over to you, Dr. Roy.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will just share my screen to start with. Yeah, thank you, Professor Mahapatra and Professor Das. And thanks to all the participants who have taken out the time to be here with us today. And a big thanks to the Mishra Center for Financial Markets and Economy for giving me the platform to present our research that was done by me and my colleague Meera. We both are associated with with ICRIER New Delhi. ICRIER is a economic and policy think tank, and we both work there. The research and the findings that I'm going to share with you is actually drawn from the working paper which is currently a work in progress for us. And the title of the working paper is Housing for Low-Income Urban Households: A Demand Perspective. Now, what really got us interested in this area is that, as we all know, that India is, of course, urbanizing at a very steady rate, right? And it is expected that possibly by 2030, the urban population would have nearly maybe, around doubled from what it was in 2000 as per the 2011 census. And by 2050, it is envisaged that, India will have a very major lion's share of the actual growth of urban population worldwide. So so the focus is very much on urban issues. And as we know that, our cities are stretched, and housing is a very key component of the entire economy and of the entire urban domain as well, right? We all need houses to live in. Housing is a necessity for us. At the same time, as I said, it contributes a huge amount to the GDP. It's a significant portion of our GDP, right? So housing is something that needs a lot of attention. Unfortunately, or rather, in the Indian context, housing research, and especially economics research and housing, has not really developed to that level as it has in the West and even certain developing countries. And our endeavor is, a small step towards filling that gap. Now, what are the issues that plague housing in urban India today? The topmost that comes to anybody's mind, right? Everybody's mind and anybody's mind is that affordability. When I want the kind of house that I want to live in, it is beyond my budget. I am not able to either purchase it or rent it. To give an example, there was a study done in 2018 by RBI for 49 metropolitan and non-metropolitan cities. By metropolitan cities, I mean cities which have a population of more than 1 million or above. And it was found that if you are a household with an income of rupees 6 lakhs per annum, you would be able to purchase a house, in the formal sector, a formal house, in the formal sector in only 5 of those 49 cities. If you had an income of 12 lakhs, you could purchase a house in only 9 of those 49 cities. Things are equally bad even if you look from the rented house perspective, right? Rental housing market perspective. That there was another study which was done for 29 metropolitan cities, which found that if you are a household in any of those cities which has with an income which is actually below the city average, you would not be able to rent a house in the formal housing market in any of those cities. So these are very stark and eye-opening statistics, and of course open to further research, but nonetheless a marker of where things are headed, and that we need to take stock. Now, why is this so? This is primarily so, of course, on the back of very high land prices, and due to this driven by this very high land prices, what we see is that is demand and supply gap, which is coming up in the formal housing market, which is already rather entrenched in the formal housing market. Now, what do I mean by a formal housing market? Formal housing market means that housing which has been constructed, which has been developed in adherence to all the planning norms, to all the other regulations, to all the building bylaws, etc., and which actually gives the resident of that house and the owner of that house, right, a clear property title. I mean, how clear? But it gives a recognized property title to that to the owner of the house. If it is not so, we consider a house to be in the informal housing market. Now, the formal and informal housing market are loose terms which are actually used in the urban policy context and might not be actually found in government documents, etc. But nonetheless, it is very important to understand what is a formal housing market and informal housing market. And it is largely in the formal housing market that all the private developers function. It is largely in the formal housing. It is largely the government's rather push that to bring as much informal market housing into the formal housing market, because the formal housing market is able to give tenure security to its to the homeowners, to the tenants who are living in it. So it's actually a very good thing, right? Now, what is happening that due to this high land prices in the city, low income, it is very difficult to develop low income housing on these land parcels, right? So what we see is that there's an oversupply at times of high income and middle income, and to some extent middle income housing, but there is not so much demand in it, right? Greater Noida is a very pertinent example in this case. Apparently, over the last 2-3 years, around 60% of the housing stock which was built in Greater Noida was vacant, right? And all this housing stock was actually built for middle income group or the high income group, and there was just not enough, consumption demand for it. Now, whereas in the low income housing category, what we see is that the formal housing market is not really able to cater much to the low income housing category. It is even the private developers who endeavor to actually, provide low income housing are unable to do so due to high land prices. And actually there's a lot of, dichotomy. There's a lot of definitions floating around for what is affordable housing in India. In certain cities like Bombay, Bangalore, even a house which is costing up to, rupees 70 lakhs or 80 lakhs is actually, classified in the affordable bracket. So there's a significant, there's a oversupply in the high income and middle income group housing in the formal housing market, whereas there's a undersupply in the for low income housing in the formal housing market. But said that, it's not that the low income people are not able to find housing solutions in the city. They find their own housing solutions. And where do they find it? They find it in the informal market, right? So whether it is slums, whether it's unauthorized colonies, whether it is resettlement colonies, or whether it's urban villages, which varies from city to city, but they do find their own housing solutions. Now, usually that housing is not built in adherence to the regulations which are already there in terms of land use, in terms of the building bylaws, etc. So in most of the cases, this housing actually falls short of of a very objective definition of adequate housing, right? So this housing has certain gaps in it in terms of the physical adequacy. It might not be built in a very safe fashion. It might be very congested, etc., etc. So there are challenges with pertaining to both affordability and adequacy in the urban housing market. And in the first part of the paper, I will be talking, addressing this issue of adequacy of urban housing, and taking stock of how big is this issue. What is the size of this housing adequacy challenge which is currently facing us? Now, ever since independence, from the first 5-year plan onwards, before the formulation of every 5-year plan, actually an estimate of the urban housing shortage was arrived at. And the last such exercise was done in 2012 in preparation for the 12th 5-year plan. And it found that based on certain very objective criteria of congested households, of obsolete households, or whether the households was unserviceable kacha house, or whether it was, it was a homeless household who did not have a home, the housing shortage was 18.78 million in 2012, and which is nearly 2 crore. Now, based on this, 18.78 million number, the current government launched its national urban housing program under the Housing for All mission called the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. And under this mission, while it started with initially a target of about 20 million houses, what they realized was, of course, and very rightly so, that this housing shortage does not translate into a demand for 18.78 million houses, right? I may be living in an inadequate house, but I might be particularly happy doing so, or I might not have the means to actually, improve my housing condition. So this inadequacy in housing does not get translated into demand for housing, right? As a result, and recognizing this, the government actually did a survey of, beneficiaries to identify that, under the 4 verticals that it had launched, that what are the, how many houses actually have, how many people are actually demanding houses under those, the 4 verticals with the subsidies, attendance subsidies that goes with it. And they found that there was an aggregate demand of 11.3 million across India, demand for 11.3 million households across India. And this is the latest figure. Actually, if you go out to the PMAY urban website, you will find that the figure is 11.29, but I just rounded it off. So 11.3 million houses is, as on date, right, the aggregate validated demand under the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana urban. And this is one of a kind, rather, rather exercise that was done under this particular housing mission. But nonetheless, what it got me thinking into that, where is this? Does it mean that this 18.78 million number was, was really kind of an exaggeration? Not really. As I mentioned, of course, housing shortage and housing demand are 2 different things, right? And that got me thinking, that got us thinking rather, that then as of today, the scale of the shortage might be very different from what it was in 2012. And the National Statistical Survey Organization under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation of Government of India came out with their housing conditions survey, household level housing conditions survey in 2019. The survey was done in 2018. And using this data set, right, primarily, and the projections by other, various government ministries, we attempted to find that what is the contemporary scale of the shortage using a methodology very similar to which was used for estimate the shortage in 2012. And that is the first objective of the paper and the Now, the second objective of the paper is actually, motivated by this difference, as I said, between the 2 numbers of shortage and demand. That is, even if a household is living in an inadequate house, unless that house and you actually are given them, most of the housing policies give price-based incentives or cost-based incentives. They bring down the cost of either buying a new house or constructing a new house or making enhancements to your house by giving subsidies, right? So they are essentially, they are price-based subsidies, right? So what is, will the price-based subsidies, how effective will they be, how effective they are in helping the household make the transition from inadequate housing to adequate housing? And we attempt to answer that by understanding the nature of the consumption demand for housing, or the demand for housing to live in among the low-income households. By low-income households, I mean economically weaker section households or households belonging to the low-income group. Economically weaker section households, as per the Government of India, Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, is any household of having 4 members and having a monthly income of 25,000 or less. A low-income group household is a household which has a similar household size, which has a monthly income between rupees 25,000 to rupees 50,000. So, and both of them together form the low-income households, and I will keep on referring to it. So, the third question which we investigated is that congestion is one of the primary causes of housing inadequacy. And in the current frame of the pandemic, right, where home isolation and home quarantining is rather is a necessary weapon in our arsenal for fighting the pandemic, right, congestion becomes extremely important in the present context. But we want to understand that, but congestion, we find that between 2012 and 2018 has severely increased, and the amount of space that a congested household consumes has severely gone down over this period as well, right? So, but if you are a congested household, and do you have any, does your demand behavior regarding housing any different from that of a non-congested household? Because understanding that is very critical if to design effective policies to actually combat congestion. Now I will, drive any questions so far?
No, not yet.
Okay, great. Okay, so I will straight away dive into my objective one, which is
Devarpita, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, there is one question now. So the question is, there is growing preference in the millennial generation for the asset-light model, where the consumers don't want to tie themselves and their savings to a location. Does the research account for this motivation? And is this trend even applicable for low-income housing?
Yes, whether this trend would largely be, applicable for middle income or high income housing. But having said that, if we are to, rather replace your millennial question with the question, of whether migrants have a, preference. And as we know that now that there is a huge lot of, there is a humongous number of, migrants in our cities who are, cyclical migrants who come to our cities for a few months and work and then go back to their hometowns or their home villages. In their case, of course, this question has a lot of weight. Now, whether a household is migrant or not, that I have not exactly, captured through my research. But you will see that, yes, from the results, we are able to draw clear insights that what are the specific, policy implications we can draw on and how should we tackle the problem of housing for migrants.
There is one other question about congestion. Increased congestion also affects one of the 4 important elements of housing, privacy. Should one negate that if the need awareness is not there among the EWS or the LIG groups? Should it not be addressed?
Yes, see, in the current context, as I said, yes, we could have said that if the need awareness is not there, 2 years back. But as on date, in the current context, where, having a home and having, a separate area to quarantine yourself or home isolate, yourself in case you are infected, I think it's not it's something that awareness needs to be created if it's not there, in my opinion.
Thank you. These are the only questions so far.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So driving then, coming to the first objective, which is arriving at macro estimates of housing shortage in urban India based on the latest data. Just a second. Yeah. What is an adequate house? Now, as per the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, an adequate house is one which is a pakka house, right? Which has a carpet area of at least 30 square meter with adequate basic facilities, toilet, water, kitchen, etc. And it has to be in the formal sector, right? It has to be built in adherence to all the regulations. It has to give a very clear property title to the owner household. That is what is an adequate house. Now, the urban housing shortage based on the definition of physical inadequacy. What is physical inadequacy? Physical inadequacy is if a household is living in congested condition. Which is a congested household? A household is considered to be congested if even one married couple in that household does not have a separate room for themselves, right? So it does not have that privacy. So it's rather in it's a definition in the social context, right? So if a household, yes, has one or more married couples who do not have separate room for each couple, then a household is considered to be a congested, living in congested conditions and the congested households. Secondly, condition of physical inadequacy is that it's an obsolete house. Obsolete house based on the rather criteria which is available in the NSS data is that if a house which is more than 60 years old or a house which is in more than 40 years old, but it is in bad condition. And then kacha houses, which is a very, very small percentage as on date, because the number of proportion of kacha houses has been declining phenomenally. And kacha houses means for the international audience, basically houses which have been built with non-permanent material, right? That like wood or mud, or even if it's built of brick, right? It's not cemented, etc., or tin, etc. And it also includes physical inadequacy, even if a homeless household is considered to be a part of the physically inadequately housed households. Now, this was the definition primarily followed by the last two technical groups, which had estimated the urban housing shortage for the 11th and the 12th five-year plan. We actually expand on this definition a bit from the perspective of slums to get a upper bound on and a more holistic idea of what is the housing challenge which currently urban India faces. Now, slums and housing policy. Now, slum housing has more or less been the cornerstone of India's housing policy, whether it is the Rajiv Awas Yojana of the previous regime, or the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana of the current regime, of the current government. They all aspire to make our city slum free, as in that all residents of the city, nobody should be living in slums, right? And everybody should have access to adequate housing. And each of these missions had as a part of them plan of actions to be drawn up for city-wise for covering almost all the slums in the cities, right? In case of Rajiv Awas Yojana, it was the selected cities. For Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, it is for rather all the cities under the mission, which is all statutory towns and cities in India currently. And based on of course, the budgets available, slums were identified, and even households within slums were identified at times for which needed either redevelopment or relocation or upgradation of the home. Now, at a slum level, tenability of the slum was very important, a criteria. Now, what this plan of what the slum-free city plan of action in case of Rajiv Awas Yojana, or the housing for all plan of action in case of Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, or the the plan of actions of the various city level slum rehabilitation schemes, what they wanted to do was actually to identify that which are the slums in need of and at each slum level, what kind of intervention is required so that that slum no longer remains a slum, right? It could be something possibly theoretically as simple as it's a notified slums and the living conditions are pretty good there, so possibly enabling land rights to the slum dwellers and eventually regularizing the slums, thus bringing it into the formal housing domain. Or it could be that no, the slum is very densely packed, and as a result of it, that density on that land parcel is not sustainable, so that the entire slum has to be demolished and rebuilt. Housing has to be given to its residents, either on that site or somewhere else. So it might involve relocation or not, but redevelopment was required of the slum. It could be that upgradation of the slum was good enough, that you upgrade the basic services of the slum, you identify the physically inadequate houses in that slum, and give incentives to actually upgrade those specific houses, right? But having said so, we do not have in the data available in the public domain, which gives us access to all the housing for all plan of action across all cities, so that we have an aggregate estimate at India level of what is the number of households that slum households at Indian level across India, which requires some form of housing intervention. So since we do not have that, right, we take the overall the total number of slum households as rather the maximum number of slum households which might be requiring intervention, because it's, as I mentioned, due to issues of tenability being that the slum might be located in an ecologically fragile zone which cannot really support housing, or it could be under a high tension wire, or it could be next to a railway line, railway track, and as a result of which, not fit for residential land use. In that case, it's an untenable slum. So that slum anyway has to be in total relocated. All the households have to be relocated to some, some other site in formal housing. In case it is tenable, right, then of course, it is seen that is it that, all houses in that slum require some form of intervention, or is it only some houses? But in case, majority of the houses might be physically inadequate and requiring interventions, in that case, it might be, feasible to actually demolish the slum and completely rebuild it, right? Or it could be that, it is so densely packed, as I said, that, all the existing households might not be, it might not be feasible to actually, accommodate all of them on that particular land parcel. And of course, there is the financial angle to it, which is a, huge lever in the entire, dynamics of leveraging slum lands, because the slum lands are usually in the, prime locations of the city. So nonetheless, so the moot point is that we do not have an idea of the number of slum households which actually require housing interventions, but it is very clear that that number is not restricted only to those slum households which are physically inadequate. The past estimates had only included those slum households which were physically inadequate, which, satisfy, which kind of, either fell in any one of those three brackets of congestion, obsolescence, or kacha housing. So, but that is, not so. So the housing in need of intervention in slums actually is much greater than that. And that is why, since we do not have an estimate of that number, we actually take an estimate. We estimate what is the likely number of the slum households in India as of 2018, and we consider that to estimate an upper bound of the housing challenge or urban housing shortage. Now, how we do estimate the number of slum households? We actually use data from various government sources itself to arrive at the estimated number of slum households in million. And we find that as of 2018, that number is around 26.5 million households would be living in slums. As per the 2011 census, I think the number was around 17 million. But as on date, we both actually, the government estimates by the Pranab Sen Committee and the United Nations Millennium Development Goals data, it shows that it's not really, rather 22%, but rather 24% of our urban population which lives in slums. And taking into account the estimated slum population for 2018 and the slum household size, we find that the estimated number of slum households in 2018 to be 26.5. I will rather. Now, how do we actually arrive at the upper bound of the or the maximum upper bound of the urban housing shortage, or the maximum urban housing shortage that we face as on date? And why I call it maximum, what is the minimum, I will just explain to you in 2 minutes. It is we find that if to this estimated number of slum households, we add the estimated number of physically inadequately housed non-slum households, and we add the estimated number of homeless households, and we find the estimated maximum number of inadequately housed urban households in India. And that number we find out to be around 47.3 million. All these households, or many of these households, might actually be having more than 2 couples which do not have a separate room. So in case, it might not be possible that just by building extra number of rooms, of course, if it's permitted, if it's possible to build, right, the land is there or the space is there to build those extra rooms, in most cases it might not be there, right, then a new house might be required to accommodate those couples, right? So there is a number, there are a few extra houses which need to be, built to address this problem of congestion, especially for households which have more than two couples which do not have a separate room. And that number of extra houses is around 2.7 million. And thus, we arrived at the upper bound of the urban housing shortage in terms of number of houses to be 50 million as of 2018. Now, how do I calculate the estimated number of physically inadequate houses? Estimated number of physically inadequately housed non-slum households in million. We do so by adding the number of non-slum households living in obsolescence, that is having an obsolete house. That is, these households are actually living in a house which is more than 60 years old or between 42 or more than 40 years old, but in bad condition. And to this, we add the number of non-slum households living in congestion out of obsolescence and the number of non-slum households living in unserviceable kacha houses. And the number and the ratios and how we arrive at this is, pretty self-explanatory, that we take the ratio of or the proportion of the non-slum households living in obsolescence, and we actually multiply that by the estimated number of non-slum households from, again, which has been estimated from the various government estimates. And thus we arrive, adding here the serial number C, E, and G, we arrive at the total number of non-slum households living in inadequate houses in our urban areas. Now, as I mentioned, that this 50 million was an upper bound. What we also did was to ensure that there was comparability between the 2012 shortage and the 2018 urban shortage, which did not, which did not take into account all slum households, right? We estimated the housing shortage for 2018 using the exact same methodology as was done in 2012. And that we find to be the corresponding figure for 2018 as against 18.78 million for 2012, we find that to be 29 million. That even on an absolute scale then, using the same methodology, we find that urban housing shortage has actually gone up by 54% between 2012 and 2018. And the upper bound or the overall size of the urban housing challenge that faces our policymakers today is actually around 50 million houses that need attention, that need some form of either enhancement, improving the quality of the house, or needs more rooms to be built, or new houses required to be actually built. Okay, now how is this how is this, how has the distribution of the shortage been? Has that really, worsened over time? We answer that question next. Now, these are our income groups, which we have already taken you through. Now, in the NSS data, we do not have the monthly income data. So how we have to actually, define each household as belonging to a particular income group based on the monthly consumption expenditure data. And we assume that below income, we actually, first of all, we actually divide the economically weaker section households, that is any household which is earning less than 25,000, into, two brackets. One, which is the below poverty line households, which are the urban poor. Now, this has not been done by any study in the past. And using the Rangarajan Committee poverty line, we find that at a month, the household monthly income of any household which is earning less than 10,341 rupees of a household size of 4 will be a below poverty line household. Anyhow, so we classify that group as EWS1 group, or the below poverty line group. The remaining economically weaker section households are classified as EWS2, and then we have low income group households and we have middle income group households. Now, what we find is that we find out that by each monthly per capita expenditure decile, what is the number of households living in slums, what are the number of households living in obsolescence, what are the number of households living in congestion. And from this table, we aggregate and arrive at this distribution, that at an India level, about 100% of the shortage, vis-a-vis 96% of the shortage, is as on date presently in the economically weaker section and LIG categories. And in LIG category, it is only 2.6%, of the shortage. The lion's share of 97% of the shortage is in the below poverty line group and in those EWS households which are non-poor but nonetheless earning less than rupees 25,000 a month. The point, of course, there's a writer here that the income brackets between 2012 and 2018, rather, they were revised in a big way in 2015, while actually the income benchmarks were actually revised upwards by almost 5 times for both EWS and LIG groups. But since these are the contemporary, rather income criteria, 25,000 and 50,000 for EWS and LIG group, we adhere to that. So what we see is that there has been, of course, in the scale of the urban housing shortage, there has been a severe, big jump. Using the same methodology, we find that, the urban housing shortage has increased by 54%, and the distribution of this shortage across the income groups has further worsened, with the shortage concentrating further in the low income groups household. So overall, of course, we get a sense of the overall scale and the direction of the urban housing challenge that is being faced.
So there is a question from a participant. The question is, affordable housing may not be really affordable for an individual earning 1 lakh rupees per month, but feeding 10 people and taking care of ailing parents. What should be the correct definition of EWS?
I think it's not so much about the correct definition of EWS, but recognizing that there are various income categories with various specific, affordability, different affordability, possibilities, or rather they can afford different, rather I would say that, we need to further sub-classify the EWS group. Earning a household which is earning 3 lakhs or less per annum, or rupees 25,000 less per annum, in a household, very rightly said that if somebody is earning rupees 10,000, the household is earning 10,000 monthly, there's a huge lot of difference. That difference needs to be recognized in policy, right? That we cannot really classify all these households, right? A household which is earning rupees 10,000 a month and a household which is earning 25,000 a month under a broad umbrella. Right, this recognition has to be there, and that is, that is what we wanted to, push forth, and that is why we did this classification into below poverty line households and non-poverty line EWS households.
So I think there's a clarification here. The person is asking about a household earning 1 lakh rupees a month, not 1 lakh rupees a year, but the household has a lot of responsibilities. And the family size is large. So I think the question is whether it is accounting for family size.
Yes, my classification here is actually accounting for family size, because how I, define a particular household in the NSS sample, whether it is a EWS, whether it's a EWS1, EWS2 or LIG household, based on the per capita expenditure here. And how I arrive at a per capita expenditure is basically monthly consumption expenditure divided by the household size for that particular household. And this benchmark has been arrived at by dividing this number by 4, as you can see, right? So an average household size is 4 is what is, generally, considered to be the norm. So any household, for example, if in my sample, any household which is earning 15,000 a month, but which has 4 members, vis-a-vis which has 7 members, that household might be bracketed under different income categories, and thus this the classification and the distribution we arrive at here is based on that, because household size definitely has a big role to play. And by the way, in the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, right, they say that a household or a family is recognized as a married couple and their children, right? If there are others in the household, that is actually recognized as a separate, family or a household. Now, actually on the ground, when terms of beneficiary selection, etc., how it plays out, that remains to be seen, and it's still discovered, but that's the criteria.
There's another clarificatory question on requesting you to elaborate on the 2015 revision of income data and the shortage of housing computed for 2018.
Okay, how much time is remaining, Professor Mahapatra, for my presentation?
We have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes.
Okay, then can I take this question at the very end? It's a very important question, but I will take it towards the end. Yeah.
Definitely. And there's another question also about the post-pandemic period. That also maybe we can take it at the end.
Sure. Okay. Now, the next objective of the paper is that what is the nature of the consumption demand for housing among the low-income households? Again, low-income households, I mean economically weaker section, and low-income group households. Now, what is consumption demand for housing? Consumption demand for housing, very loosely defined, means the demand for a house to live in. Now, housing for all of us actually satisfies, two kinds of demand. One, that we live in the house, we actually consume the housing services that the house gives us, provides us with. And it also, if we are an owner-occupier, owner of the house, it also satisfies, part of our investment demand, because a house is a capital asset, is a physical asset which appreciates in its capital value, or if you want to rent it out, we get returns from it. So it's an asset for us, right? So a house actually, for an owner-occupier household, it satisfies two kinds of demand: consumption demand for housing and investment demand. For a tenant household, it satisfies, investment demand. And in fact, there is, very elegant papers by Henderson, Ionides, and others in the, 1980s, which actually laid out the conditions, under what conditions of consumption demand versus investment demand a household actually becomes decides to become an owner-occupier household versus a landlord or a tenant household, or renter, or a tenant household, right? But nonetheless, ownership doesn't translate into living in the house, even for actually low-income households. Even in slum housing, we have about 10% of the slum housing actually, lying vacant as per the 2011 census. So even slum houses, possibly a large part of those houses also cater to the investment demand for the owners there, right? But we are interested in actually ameliorating or addressing in this paper, the urban housing shortage, or ensuring how to ensure that each household lives in a physically adequate house, right? Or lives in a non-slum, and they do not live in a slum, right? So, and that's why we concentrate on the consumption demand, or demand for housing to live in. Now, there has been studies in the Indian context using, household level data, which through the empirical lens of what actually we endeavor to do in this study, which has tried to find out that with relation to price and with relation to income, how has the housing, demand varied? Though these studies haven't really, called it consumption demand for housing, but that's essentially what this, most of these studies essentially do. And all of them, as expected, have found that housing to be demand for housing to be price inelastic and income inelastic. And our results are also along the expected lines, but we actually break down our analysis across the income categories and across settlement types of slum, non-slum, and the tenure categories of owner occupied and tenant, and find pretty exciting insights which can actually feed into actual policy making and help in making the policies more effective. Now, even for this, we use the NSSO household level data for the 2018, which was collected under the Drinking Water, Sanitation, and Housing Condition Round. We use the data for the 19 major states, and we do the analysis, estimate the consumption demand function at a household, for households in two steps. First, we use the hedonic first stage regression for estimating the predicted rent for rented houses and predicted imputed rent for owner occupied houses. In the data, there is only the declared rent from the tenant or an assessment made by the surveyor, which is captured only for tenant households. Imputed rent for owner occupied households is not there in the data. So to get to arrive at even a consumption demand function for owner occupied houses, we actually use the hedonic, we model the predicate, we use the hedonic price first stage model to arrive at estimates of predicted rent for rented houses and imputed rent for owner occupied houses. Now, why do I use predicted rent for rented houses instead of the actual rent? Is that because I want that my estimates of price and income elasticity are actually comparable across owner occupied houses and rented houses, and also that if I use the predicted rent, it would be freer from any reporting bias. Okay. Now, the variables that I consider for the hedonic price regression, the dependent variable is the natural log of rent, and the independent variables are basically variables pertaining to housing characteristics on floor area, number of room, type of house, condition of the structure, presence of bathroom and toilet within the house, presence of kitchen, availability of water, garbage collection, and I capture the neighborhood quality of the neighborhood by through the percentage of the number of households in the neighborhood or the first stage unit whose heads have completed higher secondary education. Now, what is a first stage unit? In each NSS survey for urban areas, each city is actually broken down into first stage units. A first stage unit is actually an area which has natural or man-made boundaries, right, and has about 80 to 200 households living in that area, and it's a 5-digit number which is mapped for each household in the NSS household level data set, which gives us that a fair idea that this is a particular neighborhood. All houses belonging to a particular first stage unit can be classified as belonging to a particular neighborhood. A first stage unit is also a sampling unit in the design of the entire NSS survey. Okay, and then we also have district dummies, because and we use district dummies and not state dummies because a lot of our cities are districts unto themselves. Then we have a metropolitan city dummy, that if it's a metropolitan city, it's given a dummy of value of 1, otherwise 0. And we have a slum location dummy, that if that household is located in a slum, the slum dummy has a value of 1, otherwise 0. And I will not go too much into that result. That was a fairly robust regression. We had adjusted our square of around 0.6, and most of the variables were significant. So it was a good fit. And based on that, we arrive at predicted rent for all the tenant households and predicted imputed rent for all the owner occupied households. Now we come to the modeling of our consumption demand for housing. We capture the consumption demand for housing through this function. Of course, we write this functional form after including other household characteristics. While the hedonic price function pertained only to housing characteristics, the consumption demand function also includes household characteristics like the household income, which is proxied by the monthly per capita expenditure, the household size, that's the number of members living in the household the household has, the gender of the household head, and a log of age of the household head. And using this functional form, we actually draw inferences about how it is that price, or how is it that income stimuli actually affect your consumption demand for housing. Now, this particular equation has that RH being the predicted rent or the predicted imputed rent. The PH is the rent or the predicted rent or the predicted imputed rent per square foot, monthly per capita consumption expenditure, as I explained, and household size and gender, and the log of age. Now, we can express this equation also as look at this particular dependent variable also as the log of price per square foot into QH, which is loosely we can rather express as describe as the quantity of housing services consumed. Okay. Now, of course, the consumption of housing services as the size of the area grows does not grow linearly, but for a low income household, the household size is anyway so small that we can make that, assume that approximation, that if a low income household is living in a 50 square feet house vis-a-vis somebody who's living in a 100 square feet house, a household which is living in a 100 square feet house will be consuming more or less double the housing services as a household which is living in a 50 square feet house. And assuming that, we arrive at this form, which is essentially that the beta 1 is essentially the price elasticity of consumption demand for housing minus 1. So beta 1 minus 1 gives us the price elasticity for housing services, and beta 2 gives us the income elasticity for housing services. Now, of course, I mean, since PH, the price has been, derived from the predicted rent or predicted imputed rent, the system, this is an endogenous variable and the system is endogenous. So we employ a two-stage least square regression, and the instrumental variable that we use in lieu of the price variable is this particular variable here, which is in a box. It's PH underscore short for neighborhood name, and the instrumental variable is arrived at such that the average of the predicted rent per square foot or predicted imputed rent per square foot for all of the houses located in the same first stage unit, which we described earlier. And now, why all other houses? We do not include that the particular house, right, for which we are computing this variable P, this instrumental variable. We are excluding that, right? And as a result of which, we are actually addressing two endogeneity issues. One, of course, that that the error term, the PH will be related to this in the same way to the error term as the rent. And the second is that in this regression, we do not have any metric, we do not have any variable which captures the neighborhood level price. So this also, so it's also, this equation also has an omitted variable bias, and we address that also through this particular instrumental variable. And the results there also that, and we actually, estimate this, the first function through the two-stage least square regression, which is we have the first stage and the second stage regression here. And we find that we actually estimated for 14 subsets. The subsets being that, the 14 subsets being that, for example, all owner-occupier households which are living in non-slum areas and which are below, urban poor or the below poverty line household, that's one subset. So similarly, we have 14 subsets of households, including a pooled sample by income categories. And the results are, as I said, along expected lines, right? Why I'm not sharing the exact regression results, but the derived price elasticity and the estimated price and the income elasticity from those regressions. Those regressions are there. The results are very much there in the working paper, if anybody wants to see. And what we find is along, our results are on the expected lines, that yes, consumption demand for housing is price inelastic, it is income inelastic, right? But some very interesting nuances come out. That is that the income and price elasticity of the EWS1 and EWS owner-occupied households located in the non-slum areas are less than their rental counterparts. So what does that mean? That means that these two categories of owner-occupied households which are living in non-slum areas are thus much more likely to continue living in inadequate housing following a decline in unit price or increase in income compared to renter household or tenant households, right? So it's much easier, right, in these two in India to correct rather housing inadequacy for renter households, right? Because they, of course, the transaction cost for moving for them would be lower. And at the same time, the number of owner-occupier households in these two particular categories is also large, and they have been, these households have been staying on in these, the areas that they are currently located in. For around 90% of these households have been actually located, living in the areas that they're currently residing in for more than 5 years or so, as per the data. So that's why correcting housing inadequacy is actually much easier in renter household as opposed to owner-occupier households in non-slum areas. Then price elasticity is less than the income elasticity. So any measure, any price stimuli, right? Any cost-based subsidy or price-based subsidy, if it is actually, supplemented by a income-based, subsidy or income-based intervention, which actually either it's an income subsidy or it's, an education program, or it's a health program, or it's giving them, it's a skilling program, or giving them access to more productive jobs, they are likely to be more successful for the EWS, and particularly for the EWS households and also for the low income households. Then we find that price EWS or the below poverty line households has the most price inelastic demand, right? And price elasticity actually reduces for higher income groups. Thus, any price-based subsidy, which actually, tinkers with the cost of the housing, right? Whether it is through rent subsidies or whether it is through, subsidies for owner-occupied houses, their effectiveness kind of declines as you move down rather the income spectrum. Then price elasticity, the fifth insight which emerges is price elasticity is lowest in magnitude and positive, while income elasticity is insignificant for the most vulnerable amongst all households, which is the below poverty line or EWS1 tenant households residing in slums, right? Which clearly indicates that they are the most vulnerable household, and they are at a very high risk in terms of their non-housing consumption in cases of increase in rent and decline in income, right? If the rent increases, they have to bring down their income, their expenditure on other basic items like food, health, etc., etc. And even if there is a decline in income, so and so, or they lose their housing, right? And possibly that was the reason that, we saw this, huge reverse migration both last year and this year from our cities with the introduction of the lockdowns. Then household size and the gender of the household head and the outcomes related to the age of the household were also along expected lines. And it shows that, yes, of course, in case of tenant household, it's much easier to address, the consumption demand for housing actually increases in case there is, an increase in housing, in household size, and female-headed households do need special attention because their consumption demand for housing is lower. But the moot point, which I think which emerges from this, is that yes, price-based incentives or subsidies for the low-income group households need to be supplemented by, interventions which actually support their income. Otherwise, and possibly that is the reason that, so far, so many our, that so many, urban housing policy schemes have been launched, and, so much money has been spent, but the success has been under the various missions have been very limited. And so it's something that, the policy needs to take into account. And especially the EWS1 tenant households in slums need to be, singled out as the most vulnerable category of households. And these are also where, these households are also where the bulk of the migrant populations are. The migrant population is primarily lives as tenant households in slums, and they might be earning less than the poverty 10,000 rupees a month. So the key, I think the key points which emerge from this section are, that price-based incentive need to be supplemented by income improving measures, and that vulnerable households like the tenant households, which are below poverty line households living in the urban slums, need special attention. Yes, Professor Mahapatra, any question?
Yeah, so there were two questions. One was a request to elaborate on the 2015 revision of income data and the shortage of housing computed for 2018. There's another question about the post-pandemic period, where a large section of the EWS population, the APL EWS population, has slipped into poverty. and a new class of poor has emerged?
Yes, so I will take the latter question first. And yes, the poverty, the number of people who have slipped into poverty over the last 2 years have been significant, as a lot of studies have indicated. And possibly, none of the surveys so far conducted have actually taken into consideration the housing conditions and how has the housing condition for these households deteriorated, or has these households largely, gone back to their native places where the migrant households. So it's a very important area of research which needs to be investigated. But currently, I am not able to cover that with the 2018 data that I have. So a survey needs to be actually conducted, if not, across pan India, but a dipstick survey, maybe restricted to specific cities or even specific locations within the cities. Only that will tell us. And coming to the revision of the income groups which happened in 2015 data. So while the clarification or the explanation which we have come across from government, that why was the the criteria changed. The criteria was changed essentially because it felt that the income levels of people across cities have substantially gone up. I mean, when seen in contrast, seen in contrast to the benchmarks which were set earlier of 5,000 rupees and rupees 10,000 for EWS and NLIG, and that necessitated an increase in the thresholds. And also, I think the idea was that to bring more and more people under the urban housing missions to some extent. Any other question?
So there is a question on housing for migrants. So housing for migrants is truly best served by providing transit housing and not really building housing as a collateral, temporary housing. So this is a successful global experience. China is an excellent example.
Yes, absolutely. So that is what the government has been trying to do through the affordable rental housing complex vertical, which has launched as of last year under the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Urban. And by the way, that is why I focus on consumption demand for housing. I do not focus on demand for housing as such, because when I talk about demand for housing, it has two distinct parts. One is the consumption demand for housing, which is demand for housing to actually live in. Now, whether it is transit housing or whether it is housing you live in the house you own, that is immaterial, right? So I focus on understanding that how is it that consumption demand for housing or demand for housing to live in vary across will vary by price stimuli and by income stimuli. So yes, it's a very valid point. Yeah, I think I will progress further on my presentation. Coming to the last objective of the paper is, does living in congestion have any effect on household behavior regarding housing? Because if we are to, as I said, addressing congestion is very important. It is essential also to sensitize households which are living in congested conditions, that no, you do need to improve your housing conditions, because in this pandemic world it is important to do so. And we do so by understanding that, does the demand for or the consumption of rooms vary across congested and non-congested households? We capture congestion as a variable here through the congestion dummy. That is, if a household is living in congested conditions, it has a dummy value of 1. Otherwise, it has a dummy value of 0, right? And it is this particular variable here. And we model this particular equation, where on the left hand side, the dependent variable is the log of the number of rooms, and the price, and we arrive at this price variable here. It is actually the implicit price of a room, and we arrive at this variable by using the coefficient that we got from the hedonic price regression and multiplying that by rent and dividing it by the number of rooms. Now this particular form has, if you kind of fully open up the differential equation and you actually differentiate and try across the hedonic price regression, you will arrive at this form. And if anybody is interested, it's there in a paper by Laura O. Taylor. I think the year is 1988. So anybody, it's look that up. It's there in the list of references of this working paper. Now, so the price elasticity for a non-congested households is beta 1. The price elasticity for a congested household is beta 1 living plus beta 2. Now, beta 2 is the coefficient for the interaction effect of log of implicit price of a room and congestion dummy. And similarly, the income elasticity of a non-congested household for the number of demand for number of rooms is beta 3, and the income elasticity for the demand for the number of rooms is beta 3 plus beta 4 for a household which is living in congested conditions. And we arrive at these estimates for price elasticity and income elasticity. And here in this table, if there is this asterisk here indicates that yes, the price elasticity for this particular subset of houses was different across the non-congested and the congested group. And we do find that in most of the cases there's not there's no difference, right? So actually, the given a price stimuli for increasing the number of rooms consumed, a non-congested household doesn't behave any differently than a non-congested household. And similarly, even for income elasticity, we see that most of the elasticity estimates are same across the various categories of household. If there is no value there, it means that that particular coefficient was actually insignificant for that particular subset. Now from this we get very three crucial insights, which is one, that congestion is accepted rather as a way of life. People who live in congested conditions actually do not mind doing so. So it becomes very difficult to actually address congestion, right? So if I'm living in a congested house, but I really don't mind doing so, right? So no matter what incentives you give me, unless of course they're above a threshold, and I really not interested in either relocating or enhancing or adding more number of rooms to my house. There's also there's a general lack of willingness to spend in case you're living in your own house or adding more rooms if you are living in an independent house. And this particularly so this problem becomes very very magnified in case of the EWS1 or the below poverty line households. We find that the congested EWS1 households have lower price elasticity of demand for rooms as compared to non-congested households. So here, this row, if you see, right, the congested households have a lower price elasticity than non-congested households. Now that means that actually given the same price stimuli, a congested household will not even have that, will have a lower marginal willingness to actually consume more rooms compared to a non-congested household. And but in the case of income, the situation is reversed, and congested EWS one owner occupied households do have a higher income elasticity of demand as compared to the non-congested counterparts. So price-based measures for tackling congestion, right, might not be as effective as income measures might be, right? So so price-based, you definitely need income-based measures if you want to address the problem of physical inadequacy of housing and move those congested households to physically adequate houses. You need measures which actually increase their income, either by giving them access to better jobs, as I said, or better skilling them, or actually giving them maybe income subsidies. Yes, any questions?
No. I think you can go on to the conclusions. Thank you.
Yeah. To summarize then, right, we find that the urban housing situation has definitely worsened over the last decade in terms of the scale of the shortage and the direction that it has, concentrated more in low-income group households. And the size of the urban housing challenge, of course, might be as high as, 50 million houses. So there's this, possibly huge gap of 40 million households who are not covered under the National Housing Mission, but who might still need to be, they need to be given enough stimulus so that, they actually migrate or rather move to adequate housing. And only price-based measures to address housing shortage is not enough, right? They need to be supplemented by income-based measures. And addressing congestion in urban households is a significant challenge due to acceptance of congestion as a way of life. Now, the implications for policy that we get from the research is that income and thus factors affecting income, such as health, education, etc., have a significant impact on housing demand. Hence, a more holistic approach to housing might work vis-a-vis, standalone price-based or cost-based housing policies. Just giving, targeting that, okay, we will just alleviate the housing condition of this particular household, we will improve the housing condition of this particular household might not be enough. It needs to be supplemented. To some extent, the Angikar mission of the government in conjunction with the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana has been targeting to do so. And even the state level, housing policy schemes, usually, women empowerment and, giving access to maybe, microcredit to the women members of the households, etc., are being tried out, but this needs to be, scaled up. And other ways of, supplementing these price-based incentives really need to be figured out. The government of India's affordable rental housing scheme should have, in context of migrant housing, right? It should, it specifically, it does mention migrant as a specific demographic class in addition to the EWS and the LIG housing groups. But this should also concentrate, identify or rather, rather focus on the urban poor or the below poverty line slum tenants, because they are the most vulnerable, as we saw that they are the most vulnerable from any income shock, from any price shock, and the rent. And each of these, schemes or any future social rental housing schemes that come out, though ARHC is not, quote unquote, a definition, social rental housing scheme, maybe by the European standards, etc. But nonetheless, the rents need to be fixed based on the affordability of these most vulnerable households, particularly for the migrant households and for the urban poor or the below poverty line slum tenants. And the beneficiary should be very carefully selected. There should be, regular, appraisals should be done of the beneficiaries, or to understand that if a household is, is a part of this particular, rental housing scheme, it should not be that, its income has increased and it no longer qualifies to be a beneficiary. So all those, checks and balances need to be put in place if we are to ensure that, these schemes actually cater to those which need those schemes the most. And lastly, addressing housing inadequacy through enhancement of existing house. Now, over the last 10 years, this 18.78 million houses have very often been, used to, rather use as a corresponding number, or use as a number of the new houses which are required. It's not new houses which require to be constructed. The housing shortage is not the new number of new houses which require to be, constructed. If enhancement is possible, because a substantial chunk of this housing shortage is actually households living in congestion, and also to some extent obsolete houses where the quality of the house has to be, improved further through maintenance, etc., or other forms of enhancement. Housing enhancement would be the answer. But as we see more often than not, right, this number is in popular discourse, it is interpreted as the number of new houses which is required. So whether this 29 million figure of, physically inadequately housed households for 2018, or the 50 million, which is, an upper bound of the housing challenge that we are facing, focus should be put on, reducing the housing inadequacy through enhancement of existing house. Our estimates suggest that, 7 million non-slum households, which actually live in currently congested conditions in less than a 30 square meter house, which is also not adequate by that parameter, has the potential for addressing, the congestion that the household is facing as a part. They can be considered targeted through the beneficiary-led construction enhancement program under the PMAY urban scheme. So the PMAY and the beneficiary-led construction enhancement housing vertical can actually target up to maybe 7 million non-slum households. But of course, there the criteria of whether that household has clear land titles to qualify as a beneficiary would come into play. But nonetheless, that is the potential that exists. So, but as of date, the focus of has been, from what I can we can understand from the information that is there in the public domain, is that the focus under even the existing housing schemes, whether it is the PMAY mission or the state housing missions, the focus has been on creation of new housing stock, right? That is rather preferred over enhancement of existing house, because the giving a subsidy and then tracking it whether it has been used correctly possibly is easier in the case of a new house. Anyway, if you are not living in an independent house, the question of enhancing your existing house does not come into play, etc., etc. And if you create a new house, you create that much, of course, more employment at a macro scale, etc., etc. But nonetheless, I think over the next coming decade, housing policies should be geared towards focusing more on enhancement of the existing house, whether it is that the land records of that particular house need to be first sorted out, property rights need to be provided, and the beneficiary should be brought into the housing mission fold, or targeting those beneficiaries, or giving a subsidized credit to those beneficiaries for enhancing their house. Yeah, that's all from me today.
Yeah, thank you. This is an extremely relevant topic for policy. And I would like to invite Professor Abhiman to say a few concluding words. Abhiman, you're on mute.
Just a minute. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Devarpita, for spending time and sharing your research with us. It was very valuable. Some of your, I think, concluding remarks about that, not just new construction, which possibly is going to help us, you need to think a little differently. The existing construction can address in many ways, if many, I think, legal hurdles or making things formal can actually address much shortage issues, what we think apparently is too big a problem. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we'll end the seminar now. Thank you to the speaker.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Riddhi.
Thank you, sir.
So, by the way, it was great meeting you, Devarpita. I think we have the same alma mater also. I did my master's in Delhi School of Economics.
Okay.
So, Riddhi, maybe you can stop recording now.
Sure, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you. I see that Prashant is here, but I think he is probably not, he was not in good health, and so that's why he was not able to join.
I would really, like your comments on the paper, actual paper, Professor Mahapatra, if you can take out the time, to go through that. Because even now, in terms of, there are various data limitations, of course, in the national sample survey data, household level data, right? First and foremost being that, rent itself is, a variable open to a lot of questions. And using that data, I know when it comes to the publication stage of the paper, actual publication stage of the paper, it is open to a lot of questions, and possibly,